The black maid saved the Mafia boss's daughter with the greatest proof of love. Sarah Johnson, a black maid, had worked for the Castellano family for years, faithfully serving them in ways no one could fully understand. She had seen the family's wealth, the power that seemed to echo in every corner of their grand estate. But she had also witnessed their pain. The pain of Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss who, despite his fierce reputation, had lost something far more precious than any amount of money or power. His daughter, Sophie, had been suffering for days with a condition that no one could figure out. Doctors were called, specialists consulted, but nothing worked. The house was filled with tension, the kind that only comes when a loved one's life hangs in the balance. It was during these moments of distress that Sarah found herself in a position she never imagined she would be in. The pain of little Sophie's cries echoed through the halls, and as the night wore on, the family was at a loss for what to do. Sarah knew that she had to help. She had spent years taking care of Sophie, watching her grow and become the bright, energetic girl she once was. But this was different. Sophie was fading, and nothing seemed to ease her suffering. The doctors had given up, and the tension in the room grew heavier with every passing minute. It was then that Sarah made a decision, one that would change everything. She had heard stories, rumors really, of mothers who could nurse other children when they had the means, when they had the milk. She had never considered it for herself, but tonight, something in her told her it was the only way to save Sophie. She had no idea how Dominic would react, but she didn't have time to worry about that. Without hesitation, she entered Sophie's room, her heart pounding with fear. The room was dimly lit, and Sophie's small form was curled in the corner of her crib, her tiny body trembling. Sarah approached, trying to soothe her, but Sophie's cries only grew louder. It broke Sarah's heart, and she knew what she had to do. She scooped the little girl into her arms, cradling her gently, and without a second thought, began to nurse her. The room fell silent. The only sound now was the soft breathing of the child. As Sophie's cries slowly faded, Sarah felt a deep, overwhelming sense of relief. The bond between them, so simple and natural, was all it took to calm the child. It was at that moment that Dominic entered the room. His eyes locked onto Sarah, his powerful presence filling the space. He said nothing at first, just stood there, watching her with a mix of confusion and something else, something softer, hidden beneath his hardened exterior. Sarah, still holding Sophie, looked up at him, her hands trembling. She knew what he must be thinking. She was breaking the rules, defying the boundaries that had always kept them apart. But what could she do? She was a maid, but in this moment, she was more. She was a protector, a lifeline for his daughter. Dominic's expression softened as he took a step forward, his gaze shifting from Sarah to Sophie. His eyes softened in a way Sarah had never seen before, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the woman who had quietly cared for his family, who had kept his daughter safe even when the rest of the world couldn't. He saw the love in her eyes, the same love he had always felt for Sophie, and for the first time, he understood. His voice was quieter now, the hardness gone. "Thank you," he whispered, almost as if the words were foreign to him. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She had done what she had to do, and in doing so, she had saved the one thing that mattered most to him. The room was still, the weight of the moment hanging thick in the air. Dominic Castellano stood in the doorway, watching Sarah as she held his daughter in her arms, her body trembling ever so slightly as Sophie nursed, her cries silenced by the quiet act of tenderness. The light from the lamp in the corner cast soft shadows, illuminating the two figures in an almost ethereal glow. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, as if everything in the world had paused just for them. Dominic's usually cold, hard eyes softened as he observed Sarah, something shifting within him that he couldn't quite place. The strong, imposing figure of the Mafia boss, who commanded respect with a single word, suddenly felt smaller in this quiet, intimate space. Sarah, the woman who had always been in the background, now stood at the forefront of his world, her actions speaking louder than any words ever could. She had done what no one else could. She had saved Sophie. And for that, Dominic was speechless. His gaze flickered from Sophie, now calm and content, back to Sarah. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet understanding that hadn't existed before. "What made you do this?" Dominic asked softly, his voice rough from the emotions he'd been holding back. Sarah didn't look up immediately. She wasn't sure how to answer him. She had acted on instinct, driven by a deep, maternal compassion that had nothing to do with rank or status. She needed comfort. I just wanted to help, Sarah replied, her voice steady. But the weight of the situation was beginning to settle in her chest. Dominic took a slow step forward, closer to them. His presence filled the room. But this time, there was no intimidation, no fear in Sarah's heart. It was just the two of them now, a father and the woman who had just saved his daughter's life. You've done more than help, Dominic murmured, his voice softer now, the edges of his usual command softened by something unspoken. Sarah looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a way that felt more honest than ever. The distance between them, the social gap that had always separated them, seemed to fade away. In this moment, they were just two people, one trying to save a child, the other just trying to make it through another day. I didn't know what else to do, Sarah admitted, her words slipping out before she could stop them. But I couldn't just let her suffer. Dominic was silent for a long moment. His eyes flickered to Sophie, who was now sound asleep in Sarah's arms, the calmest he had seen her in days. It was almost as if Sophie knew. She had known who could help her when no one else could. And now, Sophie was safe. But for Dominic, the emotional weight of the situation was far from over. He was used to control. He was used to power. But this was different. It was as if the very thing he had been searching for. All these years had been right in front of him, and he had never seen it. I'm not sure how to thank you, Dominic said quietly. His voice was thick with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. You don't have to, she whispered. She wasn't doing this for gratitude. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. I owe you more than you know, Dominic continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd be in this position. Never thought I'd need someone like you. Sarah glanced at him, confused. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in his tone told her that this moment had changed him. In that instant, Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss, was no longer just the man who controlled everything around him. He was a father, a man who had witnessed the power of love and sacrifice, and he was humbled by it. I'll make sure Sophie's always taken care of, Dominic said, his voice firming with a new resolve. And I'll make sure you're taken care of, too. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She had never expected anything in return. But as she looked at Dominic, standing there in the dim light, she realized that something had shifted between them. Something deep, something real. She had always been invisible to him, just another employee in his household, just another face in the background. But now, for the first time, she was seen. And in that moment, she realized that her actions had changed everything. She had saved his daughter, and in doing so, she had saved a piece of his heart as well. The days that followed felt surreal for Sarah. She had always been invisible in the grand, opulent world of the Castellano family. Her life had been defined by service, by keeping her head down, doing her job without question, and never expecting anything in return. But after the events of that night, everything had changed. Dominic's words echoed in her mind constantly. I owe you more than you know. She had saved his daughter, but she had also unknowingly earned his respect. And as the days passed, it became clear that he wasn't going to forget what she had done. As she continued to care for Sophie, the bond between them deepened. Sophie, once so distant and restless, began to warm to Sarah. The child, who had always been a puzzle to the rest of the family, now seemed to find solace in her presence. It wasn't just Sophie that Sarah had to navigate now, though. The entire household had changed. Dominic's usual cold demeanor was softened whenever he saw Sarah. He began to acknowledge her more, not just as an employee, but as a person who mattered. He would often stop by the room where Sophie was, just to check on both of them, asking about Sophie's well-being or simply making small talk with Sarah. It was strange, but comforting at the same time. One evening, as Sarah was preparing Sophie for bed, Dominic knocked on the door and entered. He wasn't in his usual suit, but in casual clothing, dark jeans, and a black shirt. He looked different somehow, less intimidating and more human. How's she doing tonight? He asked, his voice low and steady. Sarah smiled, looking down at the peacefully sleeping child in her arms. Better, she said quietly. She's finally starting to rest. Dominic stepped closer, his eyes lingering on Sophie for a moment before turning to Sarah. I can never thank you enough for what you did, he said, his voice almost strained. Sarah looked up at him, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a softness that she hadn't seen before. She could feel the walls he had so carefully built around himself begin to crumble. For the first time, she saw him not as the Mafia boss, but as a father, a man who had been broken by the loss of his wife and the fear of losing his daughter. She could understand that. You don't need to thank me, she said softly. I did it because I care about Sophie. She's like family to me. Dominic's expression shifted, the hardness of his usual persona slipping away. He looked at Sarah in a way he never had before, like he saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. And your family now too, Sarah. The words hung in the air between them, a shift in the dynamic that neither of them had expected. It was a moment of vulnerability, of trust, that neither of them had ever experienced. Dominic wasn't just thanking her for saving Sophie. He was acknowledging her place in his life, in their lives. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Sarah. I'm just doing my job, she said, though the words felt hollow. She knew she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was something more. You're not just doing your job, Sarah. You've done something that no one else could. You've changed everything for us. His words were simple, but the weight of them pressed down on her. She could see the gratitude in his eyes, feel it in the air around them. It wasn't just about Sophie anymore. It was about them. She had never expected this, never imagined that her life could change so drastically. But here she was, standing in front of the man who had once seemed untouchable, and for the first time, he wasn't looking down on her. He wasn't seeing her as just another servant, but as someone who had the power to change his world. I didn't do it for you, Dominic, Sarah replied, her voice quiet but firm. I did it because Sophie needed me. Dominic nodded, understanding the unspoken truth between them. I know, but you've done more than that. You've made me realize that I can't do this alone. I need people like you. Sarah felt a surge of warmth in her chest. It was a strange feeling, but one that filled the empty spaces she hadn't even realized were there. She had never felt valued before, not in this way, not in a way that mattered. You're not alone, she said, her voice soft. And you don't have to be. The room seemed to grow warmer as they stood there, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but filled with understanding. Sarah had never imagined that she would be here, in this position, with Dominic Castellano, the most powerful man in New York. She had never expected him to look at her the way he was now, with respect, with something deeper than just a passing appreciation. But here she was, and for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. For the first time, she felt like she belonged. The following days were filled with a strange sense of calm. The once oppressive silence that had lingered in the Castellano mansion was now replaced with an almost peaceful stillness, a quiet that only Sophie's laughter could break. For the first time in what felt like years, Dominic allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of his empire. He found himself looking at Sarah differently now. It wasn't just gratitude he felt, though that was certainly part of it. It was respect, a deep appreciation for the woman who had saved his daughter, who had done what no one else could. She had shown him something he had long forgotten, the power of kindness. And as Sophie began to thrive again, Dominic knew he couldn't just go back to how things were before. He couldn't pretend that everything was the same. Sarah's role in their lives had changed. She had become a part of their family, whether he liked it or not. It wasn't just about the nights spent caring for Sophie. It was about the way she had stepped up when everyone else had failed. Dominic hadn't realized just how much he needed someone like Sarah until she was there. As the days passed, he found himself seeking her out more often, just to talk, just to see how she was. It was subtle at first, but there was a shift in their relationship. The boundaries that had once separated them, the lines between employer and employee, between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the powerless, began to blur. One evening, after dinner, Dominic found himself in the kitchen. It was a rare sight. He wasn't one to linger in the kitchen, but tonight he had an excuse. Sophie was upstairs, already tucked into bed, and he didn't have anything pressing on his schedule. As he entered the kitchen, he found Sarah there, cleaning up after dinner. She looked up when she saw him, a brief look of surprise crossing her face. Everything okay? Sarah asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Dominic hesitated for a moment before responding. Yeah, just wanted to see how you were doing. It was an honest question, one that surprised both of them. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The sound of the clock ticking in the corner was the only noise filling the room. Finally, Sarah spoke. I'm doing well. Sophie's doing better. I'm glad that I could help. Dominic nodded, his expression softening. He could feel the sincerity in her words, the quiet humility that had always been a part of her. It was a humility that he admired. But it was more than that. It was her strength. You didn't just help, Sarah, he said, his voice low. You saved her, and I don't know how to thank you for that. Sarah looked down at her hands, unsure of how to respond. She had never been one for praise, never expected it. She was just doing what she thought was right. But the way Dominic looked at her now, with something resembling admiration, made her heart race in a way she wasn't prepared for. It was a shift she hadn't seen coming. I just did what any person would do, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Dominic took a step closer to her, his presence suddenly overwhelming. Not everyone would have done what you did, he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. Not everyone has the courage. Sarah swallowed hard. She hadn't realized how close he was until now. She could feel the warmth of his body, the tension in the air between them. But it wasn't just the physical proximity that made her heart beat faster. It was something else, something unspoken. Dominic seemed to sense her unease. He took a step back, giving her some space, though his eyes never left hers. I appreciate you, Sarah. More than you know. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She had never expected this. She had never expected to hear these words from him, especially not after everything. But here they were, hanging in the air between them, changing everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, but heavy. It was a silence filled with possibility, with unspoken understanding. Finally, Sarah broke it. You don't have to thank me, she said, her voice quieter now. I'm just here to help. Dominic studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand what she was thinking. You've helped more than anyone ever could, he said softly. Sarah nodded, her heart still racing. She had never imagined this, never thought that her simple act of kindness would lead to this moment. She had always been the background character in the Castellano world, just another maid. But now, for the first time, she felt like she mattered. She felt like she was seen. And that feeling, the feeling of being truly seen, was something she hadn't realized she needed until now. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of unspoken emotions. Dominic, the man who had once commanded fear and respect, now found himself looking at Sarah in a new light. He would often catch himself watching her, noticing the way she moved, the way she cared for Sophie, and the calm strength she radiated. It was a stark contrast to the cold, calculating figure he had built himself to be. The change in their dynamic was subtle at first, but over time, it became undeniable. He no longer saw Sarah as just a maid, a servant in his house. She had become someone important, someone whose presence had changed his life in ways he hadn't expected. Dominic was used to control. He had always been in charge, the one making decisions that affected everyone around him. But with Sarah, he realized he had let go of that control, and for the first time in years, it felt right. Sarah, too, had felt the shift. It wasn't just about Sophie anymore. She had begun to notice the small, almost imperceptible ways Dominic interacted with her. The slight softening of his gaze when he looked at her, the way his tone had changed when they spoke. She knew he was grateful for what she had done, but it was more than that. There was something deeper between them now, something unspoken, but present in every exchange. One evening, after dinner, Dominic found himself in the garden. The mansion was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze. He walked slowly, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was changing within him. It was as if the walls he had spent so long building around his heart were beginning to crumble. It was then that he saw her. Sarah was standing near the fountain, looking out over the garden, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked peaceful, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Dominic couldn't ignore. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, but when she turned to face him, the look in her eyes made everything else fade away. Sarah, he said softly, his voice carrying in the quiet night air. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. What's wrong? Dominic asked, stepping closer. She shook her head, the smile fading as she looked down. "It's nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough." Dominic frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze still focused on the ground. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be invisible, trying to stay out of the way. But now, I feel like I'm part of something, part of this family. And I don't know if I'm enough." Dominic felt a pang in his chest. He had never seen this side of Sarah before, never realized how much she had been carrying. He took a step closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You are enough, Sarah," he said, his words sincere. "You've done more for this family than anyone could ever ask. You saved Sophie's life. And for that, you will always have my respect." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was the truth. Dominic wasn't just thanking her. He was acknowledging her, truly seeing her for the first time. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Dominic reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "You've done something far greater than that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, but filled with so much unspoken understanding that it seemed to fill the space around them. It was then that Dominic realized something. He had always believed that power, control, and wealth were the most important things in life. But standing here with Sarah, he realized that there was something more, something deeper. It was the human connection, the bonds that tied them together, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Sarah," Dominic began, his voice a little softer than usual. "I don't want you to feel like you're just a part of the background. You're not invisible here. You matter. To Sophie. To me." Sarah's heart raced as his words settled in. She had never expected to hear those words from him, not in a million years. Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss, the man who had controlled everything, was telling her that she mattered. And in that moment, Sarah realized something that took her by surprise. She had never wanted anything from him. But now, in this quiet moment, she realized that she had found something far more precious than she could have ever imagined. A place where she was truly seen, truly valued. And for the first time, she felt a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in years. The days had passed in a blur, and Sarah found herself in a new routine. Sophie was doing better every day, her laughter returning in full force, her energy a testament to the resilience of a child who had been given another chance. Sarah's heart swelled every time she saw her smile. It was more than just a relief, it was a triumph. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had truly made a difference. But with the change in Sophie came a change in Sarah's life. Dominic had not only seen her in a new light, but he had also made it clear that he valued her, more than she ever could have imagined. There was no longer a distance between them, no longer a wall between employer and employee. He sought her out, not just for the care she provided Sophie, but for her opinion, for her insight, even for small conversations that seemed to have no purpose but to share a moment. At first, Sarah was unsure of what to make of it. She had always been careful to keep her distance, to remain just another shadow in the house, her presence unnoticed unless absolutely necessary. But now, things were different. Dominic would often stop by the nursery, just to check on Sophie or to share a brief conversation with Sarah. His eyes softened when he looked at her, and his voice, once so firm and commanding, had taken on a gentler tone when he addressed her. It was subtle, but Sarah noticed. And as time passed, she couldn't help but feel something stirring within her. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She had long ago learned to guard her heart, to keep it locked away where no one could reach it. But Dominic was different. He wasn't like the others. The walls she had built around herself began to crack, and with every glance he gave her, with every soft word he spoke, Sarah felt herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't expected. But still, she held back. She wasn't sure if she was ready to allow herself to feel anything more for him. He was the Mafia boss, a man with a life that was far removed from hers. She was just a maid, a woman who had spent her life cleaning, caring for others, and making sure she never asked for anything in return. What could someone like her possibly offer someone like him? It was a question that lingered in her mind every day, and though she had her doubts, she found herself looking forward to their conversations more and more. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting in the library, sorting through a pile of books, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his eyes focused on her. "Do you mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in the way he spoke that made her heart race. "Of course not," she replied, her voice a little shakier than she intended. Dominic stepped into the room and sat down across from her, his gaze never leaving hers. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with an unspoken tension. Finally, Dominic spoke. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his tone serious. "About what you did for Sophie, and about everything that's happened since." Sarah nodded, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "You've been nothing short of incredible," Dominic continued. "And I think I owe you more than just my thanks. You've done something that no one else could do, and I want to make sure you know how much that means to me." Sarah's heart fluttered in her chest. She had never expected anything from him, but hearing those words from him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, made something stir inside her. "You don't have to do anything, Dominic," she said softly. "I just did what felt right." Dominic smiled, a rare, genuine smile that made his eyes light up in a way Sarah hadn't seen before. "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But still, I can't help but feel like I owe you something more." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I want you to know that you're not just an employee to me. You're something more than that." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say, how to respond. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But at the same time, the pull between them was undeniable. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she had found someone who truly understood her, who saw her for who she really was. She had spent so long hiding behind the walls she had built, but with Dominic, it felt like those walls were finally starting to crumble. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to help, and I want to be here for you and Sophie." Dominic reached out then, his hand resting gently on top of hers. The simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, and she looked up at him, her heart racing. "You already have," he said softly, "more than you could ever know." The moment seemed to stretch between them, the world outside the library fading into nothingness. It was just the two of them now, and for the first time, Sarah didn't feel like she had to hide. She didn't feel like she had to keep her distance. She felt like she could breathe, like she could finally be herself. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the weeks went by, a new rhythm settled into the Castellano mansion. The tension that had once defined the household was replaced by a quiet understanding that things had changed, subtly but undeniably. Sarah, who had once been a shadow in the vast world of the Castellano family, now found herself woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that felt both foreign and natural at the same time. Dominic, the Mafia boss who had always exuded control and power, had become more than just a figure of authority. He had become a man who valued her not only for her work, but for who she was, something that Sarah had never expected. She was still cautious, still unsure of what this newfound closeness meant, but a part of her couldn't help but feel that things were shifting between them in ways that neither of them could fully grasp. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting in the nursery, watching Sophie play with her toys, she felt a familiar presence enter the room. She didn't have to look up to know it was Dominic. He had a way of filling a room without saying a word, his presence commanding attention even in silence. "How's she doing today?" Dominic asked, his voice as calm as ever, but there was a softness in it now, a gentleness that she hadn't noticed before. Sarah smiled, glancing up at him as she watched Sophie giggle. Her energy returned in full force. "She's doing well," Sarah replied, her voice warm. "She's stronger every day." Dominic nodded, his gaze lingering on Sophie before turning back to Sarah. There was something about the way he looked at her now, like he truly saw her, like she wasn't just a caretaker, but someone who had become important to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze, but it didn't make her nervous anymore. It felt familiar, comfortable even. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was part of something bigger than herself, something she couldn't have imagined when she first entered the mansion all those months ago. "You've done more than just take care of her," Dominic said, his voice low and sincere. "You've given me back my daughter." You've given us both a chance to heal. Sarah looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. It was rare that Dominic spoke so openly, but in this moment, it felt like the truth was finally being spoken aloud. For the first time, she realized how deeply her actions had impacted him. I just did what I thought was right, Sarah said quietly, her eyes never leaving his. Sophie needed someone, and I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Dominic stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. But it wasn't just anyone who could do what you did. He said, his voice firm, yet soft. It took someone who cared, someone who was willing to give everything for her. And that someone is you. The words hung in the air between them, charged with an emotion neither of them had fully acknowledged before. Sarah's heart raced as she looked up at him. She had always been careful to keep her distance, to maintain a professional barrier between them, but now, with Dominic standing so close, the lines between employer and employee seemed to blur. He wasn't just the man she worked for anymore. He was the father who had trusted her with his most precious gift. And she wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone he valued, someone he relied on. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to understand something that had eluded him for so long. Sarah, he said, his voice quiet. I don't know how to say this, but I feel like I owe you more than words can express. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected anything from him, never thought that she would receive anything in return for what she had done. But here he was, offering her more than just gratitude. He was offering her something deeper, something that felt real, something that felt like respect. You don't owe me anything, Dominic, she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions that surged within her. I did it because I care about Sophie. I care about both of you. Dominic reached out then, his hand gently touching hers. The simple gesture sent a shockwave through Sarah, and she looked up at him, surprised by the intensity of the moment. He had always been a man of action, a man who commanded the world around him with a single word. But here, in this moment, he was just a man, vulnerable and honest in a way she hadn't expected. I know you did it for Sophie, Dominic said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you've done something for me, too. You've reminded me that there's more to life than power and control. You've reminded me what really matters. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this side of Dominic before. He had always been the Mafia boss, the man who ruled with an iron fist. But now, she was seeing him as a man who had been humbled, a man who had learned the true meaning of loyalty and love. She felt something stir within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something more for her here. I don't know what's going to happen next, Dominic continued, his hand still resting gently on hers. But I want you to know that you'll always have a place here. You'll always have a place in my life. The words sent a warmth through Sarah's chest, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was invisible. She didn't feel like she had to hide. She felt seen. She felt valued. And in that moment, she realized that she had found a home, not just with Sophie, but with Dominic, too. It had been several weeks since that night in the garden, and Sarah found herself navigating a new world within the walls of the Castellano mansion. The connection she had with Dominic had deepened, but it was an unspoken bond, a quiet understanding that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge, yet it was always there. It was in the way Dominic would stop by the nursery to check on Sophie, or the way his gaze would linger a little longer than usual whenever their paths crossed. It was subtle, but Sarah could feel the shift. It wasn't just about Sophie anymore. It was about them. She had never imagined that her life would intertwine so deeply with Dominic's. She had never expected to become more than just a maid in his eyes. But now, every time he looked at her, she felt as though she were being seen for the first time. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't sure how to handle. But as the days passed, it became easier to accept. She was no longer just someone in the background, someone to be overlooked. She was someone who mattered. One afternoon, after Sophie had taken her afternoon nap, Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing tea when Dominic entered the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her as she worked. She could feel his gaze, but instead of the usual tension that came with his presence, it felt comfortable. Is everything going well with Sophie? Dominic asked, breaking the silence. Sarah smiled, glancing over her shoulder. She's great. She's growing stronger every day. You've done a good job, Dominic. She's a fighter, just like her father. Dominic chuckled softly, though there was an edge of something else in his voice. She's certainly inherited more from me than I'd like to admit. Sarah looked at him then, her smile softening. She had never really seen him as a father before, but the more she spent time with him and Sophie, the more she realized how much Dominic loved his daughter. It wasn't just the protective nature he displayed, but the way he would quietly observe Sophie, making sure she was always safe, always cared for. He was a father in every sense of the word. "You're a good father, Dominic," Sarah said quietly. His expression shifted, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself, as if the words didn't quite match what he was feeling. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I never thought I'd be in this position," he said, his gaze distant. "I never thought I'd have to rely on anyone, let alone a maid." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his voice, something that spoke to a deeper layer of emotion, something that had been hidden for so long. "You're not just a maid to me, Sarah," Dominic continued, his eyes meeting hers. "You're someone I trust, someone I admire." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected to hear those words from him, never imagined that the powerful, unyielding man who had always controlled every aspect of his life would say something so vulnerable. But in that moment, she realized how much their relationship had shifted. They were no longer just employer and employee. They were two people who had come to understand and appreciate each other in a way that was both unexpected and profound. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to downplay it, trying to hide the emotions that were rising within her. She had never allowed herself to be the center of attention, had never sought gratitude or acknowledgement. But hearing Dominic say those words made her feel something she had never felt before. It made her feel like she truly mattered. Dominic stepped closer to her, his presence filling the room. "No, Sarah," he said softly. "What you did was something only you could do. You saved Sophie's life. You saved mine." Sarah looked at him, her heart racing. It was hard for her to accept the weight of his words, to realize that what she had done had changed everything. But in that moment, she also understood something else. She had found something in this unexpected connection, something that felt real, something that she had never thought she deserved. "Thank you," Dominic whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the meaning they both understood but hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Sarah's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was meant to be here. Maybe she wasn't just a shadow in the background. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she had found a place where she truly belonged. The days passed in a haze, and Sarah found herself adjusting to the new rhythm of life within the Castellano mansion. She had always been someone who kept to the background, never drawing attention to herself. But lately, things felt different. She felt different. The small, subtle moments shared with Dominic had slowly evolved into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Every glance, every conversation, every small gesture from Dominic now carried more weight than ever before. It was as though they were on the edge of something that neither of them had the courage to define, but both knew was there. One evening, after a quiet dinner with Sophie, Sarah was cleaning up in the kitchen when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes that told her this conversation would be different. "Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She wiped her hands on a towel, meeting his gaze. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering of nerves in her chest. Dominic hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about everything," he said slowly. "About Sophie, about you. About us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of us. She didn't know what he meant by that, but she couldn't ignore the spark of curiosity that lit up inside her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft. Dominic took a deep breath, his gaze intense. "I know I've always kept my distance," he continued. "I've always been the one in control, the one who doesn't let anyone get too close. But lately, I can't ignore what I'm feeling." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as his words sank in. She had known that things were changing between them, but hearing him say it aloud made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She had spent so long guarding her heart, but now, with Dominic standing so close, it felt like the walls she had built were crumbling. I never expected to feel this way, Dominic admitted, his voice almost hesitant. But after everything you've done for Sophie, after everything we've been through, I can't pretend anymore. Sarah didn't know what to say. Her thoughts were swirling, her mind racing to keep up with the sudden shift in their relationship. You don't have to say anything, Dominic said, as though reading her mind. I just needed you to know how I feel. I'm not used to letting people in, but with you, it's different. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as his words settled in her chest. She had never imagined that Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss, the man who seemed so unreachable, would ever say something like this to her. It felt surreal, almost too much to take in. I don't know what to say, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I never expected this, Dominic. I never expected you to feel this way. He reached out then, his hand gently brushing against hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was filled with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had yet to be understood. Dominic squeezed her hand gently, his eyes searching hers. You don't have to say anything, he repeated softly. I just wanted you to know that you're important to me, Sarah. More than you'll ever know. Sarah's heart raced, her emotions a whirlwind that she couldn't quite control. She had always kept her distance, always been careful not to get too close to anyone. But with Dominic, it felt like the rules had changed. He wasn't just her employer anymore. He wasn't just the powerful, unyielding man who controlled everything around him. He was someone who had become a part of her world, someone who had seen her in ways that no one else had. And for the first time in her life, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this connection between them could be real. I never asked for anything, Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I never expected anything from you. Dominic shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. You don't have to ask, Sarah. You've already given me more than I ever could have imagined. He stepped closer, his hand still resting in hers. I just want you to know that you're not alone anymore. The words hung between them, and for a moment, Sarah felt like the world had stopped spinning. She wasn't just the maid, she wasn't just someone in the background anymore. She was seen. She was valued. And Dominic wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had opened his heart to her in a way she never thought possible. As they stood there, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, full of unspoken promises. Sarah felt like she had finally found a place where she belonged, a place where she was no longer invisible. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to hide. The weeks that followed felt like a dream to Sarah. The mansion, once a place where she moved through the shadows, now felt like a place she could truly call home. She no longer just cleaned the rooms or cared for Sophie. She had become a part of the family, something more than just an employee. Dominic's presence, his support, was a constant reminder that she was seen, that she mattered. Sophie was flourishing, and with each passing day, Sarah felt more connected to the little girl. They had become a team, the three of them, in a way that Sarah had never imagined when she first entered the Castellano household. But with this newfound connection came uncertainty. Sarah wasn't sure what all of this meant. The closeness she had with Dominic was undeniable, but it also felt dangerous. She had spent her entire life guarding her heart, never allowing herself to truly connect with anyone, and now, with Dominic, she found herself breaking all of her own rules. She hadn't expected this, not from him, not from herself. She had always kept her emotions in check, but now, every time Dominic looked at her, every time their hands brushed, it felt like everything she had ever known was being upended. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Sarah found herself alone in the library. She had become accustomed to the quiet, but tonight, it felt different. The air seemed thick with anticipation. She was sorting through some old books when the door creaked open, and she turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway. He looked different tonight. The usual sharpness in his eyes was softened, his expression less guarded than usual. He wasn't the Mafia boss at that moment. He was just a man. I didn't mean to disturb you, he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Sarah shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. You're not disturbing me. She set the book down and looked up at him. Is everything all right? Dominic nodded, though there was a certain tension in his posture. He took a step forward, closing the door behind him, and then paused, as if unsure of how to proceed. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "About you. About everything that's happened." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had been expecting something, but not this. "I know I've been distant at times," he continued, his eyes searching hers. "I've always been someone who keeps my emotions under control, but you've made me realize that I don't have to be that way anymore." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say. She had always been the one to keep her emotions hidden, but with Dominic, it was like everything was finally coming to the surface. She had never imagined she would hear him say something like this. "You've done something to me, Sarah," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made me see things differently, and I don't know what to do with that." His words hung in the air, charged with a vulnerability that was completely foreign to Sarah. She had always seen Dominic as someone untouchable, someone who had everything under control. But now, here he was, standing in front of her, revealing a side of himself that she had never imagined. "You don't have to do anything, Dominic," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected you to change because of me. I just wanted to help. And I want to be here for you and Sophie." Dominic took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you've already done more than anyone could have. You've made me believe in something I thought I had lost a long time ago. Hope." Sarah's chest tightened at his words. She had never expected to hear him speak so openly, so honestly. She had always been careful with her heart, but Dominic's words made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop holding back. "I don't know where this is going, Sarah," Dominic said, his voice low, almost pleading. "But I can't ignore what I'm feeling anymore. I don't want to lose this." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her heart racing. She had always kept her distance from people, always built walls to protect herself, but in this moment, with Dominic standing so close, she felt like she could finally let those walls fall. "Neither do I," she whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to feel the weight of his words, to feel the connection between them. It was scary, it was uncertain, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't just the maid. She was someone who mattered. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Dominic's eyes softened, and for the first time, he smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "We take it one step at a time," he said, his voice steady. "We figure this out together." In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. The uncertainty, the fear, the hesitation, it all melted away, leaving only the possibility of something new, something real. Sarah had always believed she was meant to stay in the background, never asking for more, never expecting anything in return. But now, with Dominic standing beside her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could have something more. She could have a future that was hers to build, a future where she wasn't invisible, where she wasn't alone. And for the first time in her life, that idea didn't scare her. As the days passed, the quiet between Sarah and Dominic felt more comfortable, more natural. There was a sense of peace that hadn't existed before. The tension, the uncertainty, had slowly faded into the background. Now, the moments they shared felt like a gentle rhythm, like the heartbeat of something new, something real. Sarah had never imagined that her life would lead her here, that she would be standing so close to Dominic, the powerful man who had once seemed untouchable. But now, it wasn't about his power. It wasn't about the wealth or the influence he held. It was about the connection between them, the unspoken bond that had grown over the past weeks. Sophie was thriving, and every time Sarah looked at her, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had saved her, and in doing so, she had given Dominic something more valuable than any treasure, a second chance. It wasn't just Sophie who had changed. Dominic, too, had shifted. The man who had once been all business, all control, had become someone who could open up, someone who could show vulnerability. He no longer kept his distance. He no longer hid behind the walls he had so carefully built. He was showing her parts of himself she hadn't expected to see. One evening, as Sarah sat in the drawing room, reading through some books, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know it was Dominic. She could feel his presence in the room before he even spoke. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice warm but quiet. Sarah put the book down and looked up at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Everything okay?" she asked. Dominic stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. "Yeah," he said after a beat, his gaze returning to her. "I've been thinking about a lot of things, and I wanted to talk to you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what this conversation would bring, but she knew it was important. "Of course," she said, setting the book aside and giving him her full attention. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. There was a quiet tension in the air, one that felt different from the usual moments they shared. This felt heavier, more significant. "You've changed things for me, Sarah," he began, his voice steady, but with an underlying emotion that caught Sarah off guard. "I never thought I would feel like this. About anyone. About anything." Sarah swallowed, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've made me realize that there's more to life than just control, more than just power and business." He paused, as if trying to find the right words. "You've shown me that there's something worth fighting for, something real." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had always known Dominic as the man who commanded everything around him, the one who never let anyone get too close. But now, hearing him speak so openly, so honestly, was a revelation. She had never expected him to say something like this. She had never expected him to acknowledge the impact she had on him. "I don't know what this is," Dominic continued, his voice softer now. "But I don't want to ignore it anymore." Sarah's mind raced, unsure of what to say. She had always kept her emotions at bay, had always been the one who protected herself. But now, with Dominic standing so close, she couldn't deny the pull she felt. "I don't want to lose this," he added, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to go back to how things were before. I don't want to pretend like this doesn't matter." Sarah looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never expected to find herself in this situation, to be the one who held such a powerful man's attention. But in this moment, she realized that she wasn't just the maid anymore. She wasn't just a woman who had served the Castellano family. She was someone who mattered. And Dominic was no longer the Mafia boss she had once seen from afar. He was someone who had let down his guard, someone who had allowed her into his world. For the first time, Sarah felt like she wasn't invisible. "I don't want to lose you either," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth, even though she hadn't fully realized it until now. Dominic's eyes softened, and for the first time, he smiled, a smile that was genuine, full of warmth. "Then we'll figure this out," he said quietly, his voice steady again. "We'll take it one step at a time." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't expected, hope. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just going through the motions. She wasn't just surviving. She was living, and she was living in a way she had never imagined. With Dominic, with Sophie, she felt like she had found something worth fighting for. And as they stood there, the quiet weight of the moment settled between them, neither of them needing to say anything else. They had reached a point where words were no longer necessary. They understood each other, and for the first time, Sarah didn't feel alone. The next few weeks felt like a delicate balance, one that Sarah hadn't quite figured out yet. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let someone in, but with Dominic, everything had changed. It was a quiet transformation, like the slow unfolding of a flower that had waited too long to bloom. Every day, every moment with him brought something new, a soft word, a shared glance, an unspoken understanding that she couldn't ignore. She had been careful not to get too attached, had always kept a part of herself at arm's length, but now, with Dominic, it felt impossible to keep that distance. The walls she had spent so long building around her heart were coming down, piece by piece. Dominic, for his part, seemed just as unsure. He had always been the one in control, the one who could make any situation work in his favor. But with Sarah, he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to navigate the feelings that were growing between them. For the first time, he was out of his depth. But there was something about Sarah, something about the way she moved through the world with quiet grace and strength, that made him want to fight through the uncertainty, to reach for something he had never allowed himself to have. One evening, as the sun began to set, Dominic found himself sitting in the garden, watching the sky turn pink and gold. The soft breeze rustled through the trees, and for the first time in ages, he felt at peace. It wasn't the peace that came from power or control, it was a different kind of peace, one that came from within. He heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind him, and without turning, he knew it was Sarah. "It's beautiful tonight," she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet air. Dominic looked up at the sky, taking in the colors of the sunset. "It is," he said, his voice thoughtful. He could feel her presence next to him, but he didn't turn to look at her. "How are you?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. He finally turned to face her, surprised to see the concern in her eyes. She was always so selfless, so focused on others, but here she was, asking about him. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "I'm good," Dominic replied, his voice steady but not quite masking the emotions he was feeling. "I've been thinking." Sarah nodded, waiting for him to continue. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had learned to be patient with him. "About you," he said, his voice quieter now. "About everything that's happened." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her. She hadn't expected him to open up like this, but something in his tone told her that he wasn't just speaking about Sophie anymore. "What about me?" she asked softly, unsure if she was ready for the answer. Dominic hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "I've never felt like this before," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to do with it." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had always known Dominic as the one who held everything together, who never showed weakness, but now, standing in front of her, he was being vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm not used to feeling like this," he continued, his voice low, almost raw. "With you, everything's different. And I don't know if I'm ready for it, but I don't want to walk away from it either." Sarah's mind was racing. She had never imagined that Dominic Castellano, the powerful man who controlled so much of their world, would stand here and admit something like this. It felt surreal, like she was living in a dream. She had always been careful, always kept her emotions hidden, but now, in this moment, everything seemed to shift. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said softly, taking a step closer to him. "We can take it slow. We don't have to figure everything out tonight." Dominic looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if he were trying to read her thoughts. "I don't want to lose this, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you." Sarah's heart swelled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. It was a fragile feeling, one that she had learned to suppress, but now, standing here with Dominic, she realized that she didn't have to hide from it anymore. "You're not going to lose me," she whispered, her voice steady. "I'm right here." Dominic reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and for a moment, everything else in the world faded away. It was just the two of them, standing in the garden, surrounded by the warmth of the evening. "I'm not used to feeling vulnerable," Dominic said softly, his thumb lightly grazing her hand. "But with you, I feel like I can be. I don't know why." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "Maybe because you don't have to carry everything alone anymore." Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in him that made him seem more human, more real. He wasn't the Mafia boss anymore. He was just Dominic, the man who had opened his heart to her, the man who had shown her a side of himself she hadn't expected. "I don't want to go back to how things were before," Dominic whispered, his voice full of sincerity. "I don't want to lose this connection we've found." Sarah nodded, feeling her own heart racing with the same uncertainty, the same desire to hold on to something real. "Neither do I," she whispered. And in that moment, they both knew that they weren't going to let go. They had come too far, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The air was cooler now, the seasons shifting as they always did. The days were quieter, filled with a calm that Sarah had never known before. The mansion, once a place of distant duty, now felt like a home, a place where she was more than just a servant. She had become an integral part of the Castellano family, and it was something she still couldn't quite believe. Dominic's presence in her life had become a steady comfort, a presence she could no longer imagine being without. Their relationship had evolved slowly, gradually, from something tentative and unsure to something that felt deep, meaningful, and real. They had stopped questioning the direction it was going, stopped wondering what would happen next. They were simply enjoying the moments they shared together, one step at a time. Sophie, too, had blossomed under Sarah's care. The little girl, once fragile and quiet, now ran through the halls with a joyful energy that brought warmth to every corner of the mansion. Dominic would often stop by the nursery, just to see her, just to be near her. He had become the father he had always wanted to be, the father Sophie deserved. And he had Sarah to thank for that. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Dominic and Sarah found themselves alone in the garden once again. The familiar peace of the place, the soft rustling of the trees, filled the air as they sat together, side by side. It was moments like this, Sarah realized, that made her feel truly alive. They didn't need to speak all the time. The silence between them was comfortable, easy. It was enough just to be in each other's presence. "I've been thinking," Dominic said quietly, his voice breaking the stillness. Sarah turned her head to look at him, her curiosity piqued. "About what?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the warmth of familiarity. Dominic hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if gathering his thoughts. "About us," he said at last, his voice steady but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "About everything we've been through, and everything we've yet to face." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never been good with uncertainty, but hearing Dominic speak like this made her feel a surge of emotion. She had never imagined she would be the one to change his life, to be the one who made him reconsider everything he had believed about control, about relationships, about love. "I know I've never been easy to deal with," he continued, his eyes meeting hers now, filled with a sincerity that was impossible to ignore. "I've always kept everyone at arm's length. But with you, it's different." Sarah's chest tightened. She had never expected him to admit something like this, never imagined that he would let his guard down enough to let her see the man behind the Mafia boss. But here he was, completely vulnerable, completely open. "I never thought I would feel this way," Dominic said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I would need someone. But now I can't imagine my life without you in it." Sarah felt a rush of warmth spread through her. She had spent so much of her life guarding herself, keeping her distance from everyone around her. But with Dominic, everything had changed. She had stopped running from the feelings she had tried to bury for so long. And now, as he sat beside her, looking at her with so much emotion in his eyes, she realized that she didn't want to run anymore. "I don't know what the future holds for us," Dominic continued, his voice still soft, filled with something that Sarah couldn't quite put into words. "But I do know that I don't want to go through it without you. I don't want to go back to the way things were." Sarah looked at him, her heart racing in her chest. She had never imagined that she would be here, in this moment, with Dominic Castellano. The man who had once seemed like a stranger, someone untouchable, now felt like someone she couldn't live without. "I don't want to go back either," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to go back to being invisible, to being just a maid. I want to be here, with you." Dominic reached for her hand then, his touch gentle but firm. He squeezed it softly, as if to reassure her, as if to remind her that they were in this together. "You are here, Sarah," he said, his voice steady. "And you always will be." The weight of his words settled in her chest, and she realized, in that moment, that she had found something she had never thought possible: love, acceptance, and a place where she truly belonged. They didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to figure out the future right then and there. All that mattered was that, together, they had made it this far. And with Dominic by her side, Sarah knew that they could face whatever came next. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to hide. She had found her place, and it was right here, beside Dominic.